Hello, welcome to lw10 Introduction to Texturing. In this training video, we're going to cover all the basic aspects of creating great textures from model preparation to final render. We'll discuss some of the pitfalls of importing geometry from other software packages and get into such topics as preparing clean, orderly geometry, creating production-friendly surface naming assignments, basic material construction using both original layer-based surfacing system as well as the node-based system, refining materials to get the look we want, including how to avoid creating invalid textures, and a discussion about the pitfalls of creating glass, metal, and other reflective materials. And finally, some turntable lighting and rendering techniques to make your model and textures look great. Here we'll discuss creating a rendered image that is compositionally strong and makes good use of negative space. Okay, let's start by loading up an OBJ that was modeled in another software package. In this case, this model comes from Softimage. Load up this mech object, mech.obj. So we notice on loading that there are 1135 non-planar polygons. This isn't going to be a big deal for us since this object is going to be sub-D'd, so we don't have to worry about non-planar polygons. Let's switch to a quad view of this, D for display options. And I'll just switch to a quad view right here so we can take a look at this model. Okay, so here we go. There's a lot going on here. There's the mech. Over here there's some polygons for muzzle flash. The ground is involved in there. And the first thing I want to do is I want to take this model and I want to separate it into layers to make it a little bit more manageable. So that's pretty easy to do. I'll select these polygons that look like they're part of the muzzle flash. I'll just cut them and put them in another layer. Back to my original layer. I'm going to grab my ground here, cut it and put it in another layer. And there's these rocks down below. I'll cut them and put them in another layer as well. Looks like I missed a rock there. And then there's some debris here. I'm going to throw that into another layer. And another rock. I'll actually move this rock over to the rocks layer. Okay, so now I have my mech. I have his muzzle flash. I have my ground. That's going to be my little rotation disc for my final model rotation. And I have some rocks on top that the mech is standing on, and I have a little bit of debris over here. So let's just take a look at our layers editor. And we'll see that we have our object named mech. The first layer is called mech, and the new layers that we created are unnamed. So what I want to do is I want to give new names to these layers, and then I also want to parent them directly to the base layer so that when I load this into layout to texture, light, and render, I only have to move one object around. I don't even have to, I could parent things in layout, but if I just think of it ahead in Modeler, it's just one less thing I have to do later. So my mech layer is well named mech. This layer is muzzle flash, so I'm going to rename it muzzle flash. I'll double click on it and I'll give it its name. Now, if you're working at a pipeline with a lot of other artists, and this is just a good naming convention tip, it's always a good idea not to use uppercase and always to separate words by an underscore. Don't leave empty spaces in there, especially if you're working in Unix or Linux-based systems. These can become problems. So when I want the parent, I can assign the parent right here. I want the parent to be mech. This is my base, so I'll call this base. And again, I'm just going to parent it to mech. And I'm going to actually parent all of these to mech, and then once I get into layout, I'm going to make all of the other layers unselectable. I'll lock them so that whenever you're trying to move the object around, you just select the one item and everything will move. You won't have an option but to select the parent item. I'll name this rocks. And I'll name this debris. again, parent it to mech. Okay, now since I'm going to be sub-D'ing most of this model, as a matter of fact, I'm going to be sub-D'ing everything except for the muzzle flash. I want to grab all the other layers, bring them into the foreground, and check them for n-gons. And n-gons are polygons that are anything above 4 vertices. Of course, using our regular sub-patch system, we can only subdivide polygons that have 3 or 4 vertices. You can actually switch to, down here, your sub-D type can switch to Captain Clark if you wish to subdivide n-gons. However, Captain Clark is much slower, much more difficult to work with. So I prefer to simply stick to 3 and 4 point polygons and use the regular Lightwave sub-D system. So there's 2 ways I can select all my other layers. I can either shift select them up here in my layer based system, or I can open my layers panel with F7 and I can select them. I can shift select them this way as well. Once I have all of those selected, I'm simply going to open my statistics panel. You can see statistics down here, or I can type W to open that. I'll look at the polygon statistics and I can see that most of the polygons are 3 and 4 vertices, and there's 137 polygons that are above that. So I'm just going to take a close look at those. See what we have. They all seem to be fairly minor bits and pieces. Normally, if this was a final production model, I would very carefully go through every bit and piece and turn them into 3 and 4 point polygons in a way that would enhance the polyflow of my model. For expediency right now, I'm just going to triple them. So it's going to take anything that has more than 4 vertices, all of these selected polygons, and it's going to make them all into trigons. It's going to split them up procedurally. The disadvantage to that is we don't know what the end polyflow is going to be, but for the purposes of this training video, we'll just triple them. Okay, so those are now all trigons. You can actually see if we just look at them, that everything's turned into triangles that was n-gons before. See, for example, you can see this one was 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it's split now into 3 triangles. Okay. We can just double check that we've caught everything and made everything subdividable just by subdividing it tab key. And it should all subdivide with no problem. And it does. So we're good to go. Now, moving this into sub-Ds and modeler is a little bit heavy, so we're going to just leave it at polygons for now, so we can get around easily. And now we're going to check and see what we have for materials. Now remember, this was an OBJ that came in from another software. We're going to save it as an LWO. The reason is OBJs are kind of the lowest common denominator for object file formats. Every software loads OBJs just about, as far as I'm aware. And other object formats such as LWO can carry a lot more information. So we're going to save this as an LWO eventually. But first, let's just take a look at the materials. So we'll open the surface editor, and we'll see that there are a whole bunch of materials on here, with each one with a numeric name. So figuring out what any one of these materials is pretty tough. We have to grab a bunch of them, and I changed their luminosity to try to figure out what they are. But yeah, you can see a couple of items here changing when we do that. Basically, this object is split up into way too many materials to be useful, and they're also named in a way that's actually completely useless. Who's supposed to know what material 112 is? So we want to talk about creating material names for this object that are going to be production friendly. And what that means is you as the artist are going to add materials to this model, and then when you are suddenly called out of town or break your leg and end up in the hospital for 3 days, another artist can sit down, look at your materials, know exactly what they are, and continue your work because deadline is 3 days away and you're going to miss it. This is very crucial to a production pipeline when you're working inside of a team. So we're going to change this. Now one of the things I often see when we're bringing in software from other packages, especially from Softimage, is that luminosity is set to 30% by default, and that's obviously not on. Luminosity means that our object, or that our material, is emitting light into the scene, or is appearing to emit light into the scene. So the first thing we want to do is make sure that is off. So we'll just shift select all the materials, set our luminosity to 0, and now we have a simple gray colored material to start with. We should probably also start with our glossiness and specularity turned off, just so we have something simple to start with. Okay, actually, even simpler than that, I'm just going to select every polygon in here. Just lasso select them all, and I'm going to assign them all to default texture. So now we only have one material in here. Now we're not going to see those materials disappear from the surface editor until we close Modeler and open it up again. So I'm going to do that right now to get rid of these materials. So I've gone ahead and done that. I closed Modeler and reopened it. You can see most of the materials are gone. There's still 4 left. This is because we didn't have the muzzle flash selected when we renamed everything. We can see fairly easily that these 4 remaining materials are muzzle flash simply by turning the luminosity up. So we'll rename these muzzle flash. Q to rename the surface. Muzzle underscore flash. And these extra material names will disappear the next time we close and open Modeler. Okay, now before we continue on this model, one of the things we often run into going from one software to another is scale differences. So we want to check the scale of this object. We also want to reposition him so that he's standing on the ground plane. Right now he's half underground. This means whenever we load this into a scene that has a ground plane at the origin where it should be, this mech is going to be partially underground. So first let's check our scale. So this is a human being in a mech suit. Human beings inside there, the mech suit's probably a little bigger. So let's say that this whole object from feet to the top of this backpack is supposed to be about 3 meters. And if we look at our grid size, we can see the grid is currently 5 meters. So this guy is currently 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, about 30 meters tall. So he's about 10 times the size he needs to be for our purposes. So we're just going to scale this model down. That's pretty simple. Shift H for scale, N numeric panel, and I'm just going to set this to a factor of 10%, and apply it. Now when we zoom in, we'll see that our grid is half a meter, so we're looking 1, 2, 3, about 3 meters. That's got to be close enough. So now let's position this model so that it's standing on top of our ground plane. Zoom in on that, make sure we don't have any out. We're a little bit above there. So I want to get it really nice and close so that our contact shadows work properly. So now we have our guy who's roughly correctly scaled. He's standing on top of the ground plane. And the next thing we have to do is break this object up into a bunch of sensible material names. Now it is possible for us to have one material and have one huge UV map. But it's a lot easier to manipulate individual materials that are clearly obviously different. And here's what I mean. If we take a closer look at our object, we have this visor here that's going to be some kind of glass. We have this stuff that's going to be some kind of armor. We have a gun. We have an ammo belt. We have rocks. These are all going to be pretty different materials. And it's possible to paint them all on one map, but it's far, far easier to work if you have your geometry split up into a bunch of different material names that apply to the different parts. Here's a technique I like to use for that. Right now I'm just going to grab our mech layer, and I'll, for example, grab some polygons on these gun barrels, and I'll select all connected. Now I have gun barrels. I'll name those gun barrel. And now I'm going to hide them using the dash key. So those are hidden. They're still in the model, they're just not visible. Now I'm going to select the actual gun body. I can select a bit more in here. I want to get all of the gun body here. I can always add to that later. I think that's pretty good. I'll name that gun body, and I'll hide those. Oh, there's some more polygons I can stick into the gun body. Make sure to select all connected, and this time when I hit Q to change surface, the last surface name I assigned is already in there, so I just have to click OK and minus to hide those. Go again. Q, gun body, minus. Now I may want to start working on the armor. So I'll grab a bunch of the big front armor pieces, some of the armor on the arms, whatever I can see in this view. Just a polygon on each piece is all I need. Select all connected, name them armor, hide them. This reveals more below. There's lots more armor pieces I can take here. Armor, and hide them. Underneath, there's all these funny cables. So I'll start selecting some of these cables. Select connected and hide them. And you can see by using this technique what's going to happen eventually is I'm going to run out of geometry. And when I've run out of geometry, everything is named well, and then I'll have a nice list of well-named geometry layers. So I'll be able to select my geometry not only by selecting polygons and selecting connected, but also by a material name. So I'm going to carry on and finish this. I'll pause the video while I do that, and then I'll come back when I have it all done. Okay, I've gone through all the geometry in this object, and I've also gone through the base, the rocks, and the debris and so forth, and I've given them all material names. And you can see I have ammo belt, armor 2, 3, and 4. I thought I'd like to split up the armor and maybe do slightly different treatments to them. I have one for the backpack, one for all those cables, debris, there's glass, the inner glass for the visor, the ground, gun barrels, gun body, the hand has a separate texture. There's high-res ground and high-res rocks. I've actually done a high-res and a low-res version of the ground. There's one for the muzzle flash, one for the rocks, and one for the exterior visor. Now, one of the really powerful things about naming materials this way is that I can now select these using a material name. For example, if I want to get all the cables, I don't want to have to hide all the armor to get all the cables. There are a lot of cables inside there. I can simply open my statistics panel down here or type W to open this up. And here I can select the surface. So I can select the cables surface and simply click the plus beside it to select them all. There's all my cables. So I can use this to grab the cable to manipulate the geometry, or I can use this surface name to make changes to this material that are different from all the other materials on the surface. So there are quite a few really good advantages to a really orderly and simple naming convention like this. Imagine trying to do this with material 113 and material 114 and material 115. That would be impossible. Okay, before we head over to layout and put this in a simple lighting environment, we can apply a basic texture which has already been painted by the artist. If we look in the UV texture editor, switch to textures and look at our mech UV, we can see that there's a fairly complex UV set here, and it's the whole object broken up into one UV set. There's also an associated image map, and I've loaded that up. It's called Komodo Color. We can put that in the background and we can see how things are lining up with the UV set. So let's go back into our quad view, look at our perspective view, and we're going to assign that color map to all of these surfaces. That's fairly straightforward. We'll just grab the top surface, open the texture editor for the color channel right here, and set our, so we're using, the layer type we're using as an image map. Our projection is going to be UV, not planar. We'll need to select our UV map, which is named mech_UV, and our image is already loaded. It's our image Komodo color target file, and that will apply the color image to the currently selected material, which is ammo belt. And you can see that there's now some color on here that wasn't on there. Now we want to quickly apply this color to all of these materials because we want to have a quick look at it and make sure that it's all working before we go over to layout. That's pretty simple. Simply right click to copy, multi-select all the other materials, just shift click from the top to the bottom, and right click to paste. Now that color map is on everything in here. So let's have a closer look at this model and see how that's working. I'll just close the surface editor so we can get a better look. Things seem to be lining up fairly well. Okay, good. So we'll shoot this over to layout and I'll see you over there. Okay, here's our object in layout, ready to start getting some texture work done on it. Let's open up our scene editor and see what we've got here. So the first thing we'll notice is that the base, the rocks, the muzzle flash, and the debris are already parented to the mech. So now everything will move with the mech wherever we put it. And we'll notice that underneath it there are some other objects that aren't parented. Those are the high-res objects that I mentioned before. We're actually going to use the low-res objects right now, so I'm just going to grab these two high-res objects, as the rocks and the platform, and I'm going to just remove them from the scene. So with that out of the way, the first thing that I'd like to discuss to you is the first really major advancement for lighting and texture artists in Lightwave 10, and that is the in-screen VPR. We're familiar with our texture shaded solid wireframe and our textured and our wireframe and our whatever other types of drawing in OpenGL. Well, now guess what? We have a VPR. This is an actual interactive real-time renderer. And for lighting and shading artists, this is gold. And let me show you what I mean. If I go to my perspective view, I can zoom in on this guy. I can pan around. And this is just with one light on, but you're going to see as we carry on that there's even more capability than that. This thing renders real time as we go along. So for lighting and shading artists, it could hardly be better than this. Note that this is NewTek's first implementation of this VPR in this window, so I have no doubt that greater functionality and even greater interactivity is going to come as they put more and more effort into developing the VPR. And now the VPR is available in all windows. For example, if I'm working in a quad view, let me just switch to a quad view here. I can have my VPR in one window, or I can have it in all windows I want. If I wish, although we have to recognize that as we add more and more VPRs, performance is going to suffer a little bit. So for me personally, when I'm in layout, I usually only work in a single window anyway. Not always, but usually. So I usually only have to worry about a single VPR rendering. So using our VPR and just looking around, we're going to actually stick to VPR for a fair bit of this work. One of the things that I noticed is that when I assigned the color map to all textures, I actually inadvertently assigned it also to the muzzle flash and to the debris layer, and it shouldn't be on there. So I'm going to open up my surface editor and clean those out right away. So I can find my muzzle flash, and if we'll see that there's a texture on there, that's the one that we added. I'll just shift click to delete that. Now that's off. We can identify this material right here. And also on my debris texture, which is down here, this thing that looks like a ladder, I'll find the debris right here, and I'll shift click to remove that as well. Now that's better. Now Cameron, the artist who created this model, provided two additional maps for the mech, a reflection map and a speculator map. So I want to quickly hook those up just to see what they look like. I'll open my texture editor again, make sure my layer type is on image map, which it is by default. Again, switch to a UV. It's going on the same UV set, mech UV. I'm going to load the image, and the image is Komodo spec. So there it is. And if I want to look closely at that image map, of course I can open my image editor, go to my spec and double click it here to open up the image viewer and take a good close look at my spec map. Here's one of the things that I notice about the spec map. There are color values in here. And here's an optimization tip. If you really want to optimize your RAM usage, you can take things like spec maps and reflective maps and any map that should just simply be a grayscale image, take it into Photoshop and drop it into grayscale color space. That's 8 bits, only 8 bits of color space, and the reason is an RGB image like this takes 3 channels of 8-bit, so the file size is actually 3 times the size. So it's obviously a really good idea if you're running a heavy scene to open all of your monochrome maps and drop them into monochrome color space. So let's just quickly pop into Photoshop and take a look at how to do that. Okay, here we are in Photoshop, and we can see that our image mode is currently RGB color. And very easy to drop down into 8-bit space. Simply switch to grayscale. It'll ask if you want to discard the color information. The answer is yes. We definitely want to discard the color information. Now I'm going to save this under a different file name, Komodo spec gray. Again, as a target file. I'm going to load these 2 images up in layout, and we're going to take a look at the difference. So this Komodo spec RGB is 48 megabytes. If I now load up the Komodo spec gray, we'll see that it's only 16 megabytes. Even though it's still a 4K image, it's 1/3 of the size in RAM. So this is a major memory optimization. I've gone ahead and done the same thing with the Komodo reflection map, so let's just load that up. Komodo reflection gray, and that's loaded in now as well. Again, we can take a close look at that by double clicking it right here, and it'll open up in our image viewer and we can inspect it carefully. Okay, so let's just go ahead and apply these 2 maps, the spec map and the reflection map, into the channels in our layer editor here. So we've already added our spec map here. Go into our reflection channel, do the same thing, open our texture editor, image map, projection UV, UV map mech UV, and the image we want to use is this reflection map. Use texture. Now we have reflection specularity added to our object. However, we hardly notice any difference. The reason is because these 2 new channels we've only added to the ammo belt so far. Again, we need to copy and paste that to all these other materials. So again, simply right click to copy, multi-select everything else except for muzzle flash and debris. Right click and paste. So now all these materials except for debris and muzzle flash have all the new channels. And of course we also need to apply a bump map. So in our bump channel here, again we can click texture. We haven't loaded this one up yet, but it's image map, UV map is the same. This time we'll just simply load the image from here, load image, and it's Komodo bump. And this one I've converted to a grayscale image as well to save RAM. So there's a bump map now just on the ammo belt. Again, we'll copy this, select everything except for, I'll control click to remove rocks, muzzle flash, ground, and debris. Then right click on any of the other ones and paste it in. So now we have a bump map applied to our mech as well. Okay, before we really get serious about lighting this, we're going to need to convert this mech to sub-Ds. Otherwise, it's just too polygonal. It's going to look pretty ugly. We want to see what it's going to look like all smoothed out. So I'll pop back to modeler, sub-D the object, bring it back into layout. Alright, so here's our model back in and it's subD'd. You can see that polygonal edges are all gone. To begin with, I'm just going to work on the mech body. I actually don't need the debris or the ground or the rocks in view, so I'm going to actually hide them so that I can get a little bit more interactivity. This is pretty straight ahead to do. I'll open my scene editor. My debris, I'll simply make it invisible and hidden in OpenGL. Muzzle flash, same thing. And the rocks, the same thing. So that all that I'm, and I'll do the same thing with the base as well. So that all that I'm left with, and all I have to calculate in my VPR right now, is my mech guy here. And you can see, actually, that for a subD'd object, he turns around pretty smoothly in VPR, which is pretty amazing. Okay, there's two things that immediately draw my attention about this render that are bothering me. One is you can still see polygon faces in the render. That's pretty straight ahead. Now let's just look back at our surface editor and at our visor material here. This is it here. I can identify it by just punching my luminosity. So that's our visor there. Simply turning smoothing on. Now in Lightwave, smoothing isn't the same as it is in other softwares. This doesn't actually do geometric smoothing. This is just a shader trick. This simply smooths over the polygons and doesn't show you the polygon edges. It just interpolates across them to create a smooth looking material, which actually is a lot more efficient than subdividing to the point where you can't actually see polygon edges anymore. The second thing I notice is it looks like some highlights have been painted into the material. Now, in gaming, this is a really common technique to paint highlights and shadows into the material, or in fact to light the material and then bake that lighting into your object. This has real advantages in gameplay. Obviously, it means some highlights and shadows you're not going to have to calculate at render time while you're trying to achieve real-time playback. However, if you're going for really high quality texture, these highlights need to play across the material as the object moves or as the lights move around the object. And if you paint highlights and shadows into your material, you're not going to get that, and it's going to look like areas of dirt or of fading and not really like highlights at all. Let's just have a peek at the texture map in Photoshop to see if that is in fact the case. So I'll just load up the color map. So here I have the Photoshop file that contains all the layers for the color map. Let's just have a zoom in and take a look at some of these. So for example, yeah, we can definitely see here that highlights and shadows have been painted into our color texture. And we don't really want that. So we'll look at all of our layers here, and we see that we have, let's have an exploration here. We have some nice grunge that's been added. That's good. Layer 27, layer 28. This is actually not really well named. It would be helpful if these layers were all named, as well as words like grunge, metal highlights, metal shadows, and things like that. Chevrons. So most of these are actually fairly well named. But simply leaving just a layer number on there isn't actually helpful to another artist that may have to come along and figure out what you've done. So let's just look at our metal highlights layer and see what that's doing. Okay, so these highlights are painted along edges of, presumably along corners in the geometry. Let's actually turn on the UV set to have a look. So that looks like that's the case. I'm going to go ahead and turn off those highlights because I'm going to create those highlights using reflection or specularity and lighting, and it'll feel a lot more natural in the end. And there's also metal shadows here, so let's look at that. Yeah, so there's underneath shadows here happening as well. We're going to turn that off as well because we are going to create our shadows naturally using real shading and real lighting and cast shadows and so forth. So I'll save this out as a new color map. You can see it looks quite a bit different. It's a little simplified, and actually the final result in the render is going to be a lot better now. So I'll go ahead and save this out and meet you back in later. Alright, so here we are back in layout, and I still have my original color image in there. It is called Komodo Cull.targa, and I've renamed the new one Komodo Cull 02. So I want to replace this image with that one. Simply click the replace button, go to my Cull 02, and replace it. And when this renders out, we'll see that those highlights are now missing. And that's fine because we're going to recreate those. You'll notice that there actually are some real lighting highlights on here. And the beauty of these real highlights is that they will move across the object as the object rotates. It's hard to see that real time with the VPR render. However, when we do our final rendering, you can actually see those specular highlights moving across the object. And that's really crucial to getting a really great texture feel on this object. So I really very strongly recommend that you don't paint in highlights and shadows into your texture map. It's actually going to make your object feel more fake and more gamey. So to begin with, let's take a look at this visor material. Now, here's a material that's kind of interesting. It looks like textures haven't made it onto the top and bottom portions, but the central section obviously has some color map on it. Let's just zoom in on that and take a closer look. But I kind of feel like I'd like to go a little bit towards Master Chief on this visor. So I want to add a little bit of goldy color to this. So I've got my visor material selected, and I'm going to bring down some blue to bring a little gold color into here. Something in that range. I'll adjust it a little bit more in a bit. But I also want to make my material reflective. So this needs to be a shiny, reflective kind of glass. Right now it has a specularity on it and no reflection. It's got a low glossiness, so we see this large specular highlight. What specularity means in Lightwave is reflection of light sources, only reflection of light sources. And what reflection means is reflection of nearby geometry or background textures or whatever. So specularity and reflection in Lightwave really refer to reflections of different things. Specularity is light reflections, and reflection is object and texture reflections. So we may want to reflect our lights off these materials, and that's not a bad idea. It's a lot easier than actually creating a geometry light and having it bright enough to reflect in the material. But there are some disadvantages, such as the specular highlights tend to be far simpler than light reflections in reality. But in most cases we can get away with them. Usually not on reflective materials though, they look too simple. So we'll turn up some actual reflection to see how that helps us. So I've turned reflection up to 55%. And it really doesn't look awesome. There I've turned it up to 100% now. It really isn't looking great. The reason it isn't looking so great, the main reason, is that it's only seems to be reflecting the nearby geometry, and it seems to be reflecting nothing out here. So this is still the same kind of flat color it was with reflection off. I'll show you. I'll turn reflection off. Looks not really that much different than with reflection on. Doesn't look awesome. Well, there's a simple reason for that, and the reason is there's nothing for this to reflect. The environment around this whole object is just a big empty black ball. So if we're going to start creating materials that are supposed to be reflective, the first thing we need to do is put something nearby to reflect. Now in this case, I don't want to build an entire ruined city for this guy to be in, but I do want to get on with the business of texturing, so I want to put something for him to reflect. So I'm just going to put an image into the background. It can be just about any image. You could use an HDRI image, but I caution you against that because there can be incredibly high values in real HDRs that will overblow your exposure, and you really don't want to do that while you're texturing. You want to work under fairly low range, normal, simple lighting while you're doing texturing to create really good, strong, valid textures so that when you put them into any lighting situations, they just work naturally. So I'm just going to go onto the internet, I'm just going to do a search for like some panoramic image, and I'm going to throw some simple low range JPEG panorama in the background, and I'll be back in just a moment. So I went ahead and just did a search for panoramic photograph, found some panoramic image of a city with a sky in the background. I'm going to put into my background, opening Windows, Backdrop Options. I'm going to add environment, texture environment. This allows me to put a texture on my background just exactly the same way as I would put a texture on my materials. You'll notice what the texture editor is the same when we open it up. I want the axis to be y-axis so it wraps around the poles above and below. And here's my texture editor. So layer type is image map. I want a spherical projection so it'll wrap around spherically. And the image I'm going to select is this panoramic image that I selected. I'm going to make sure it's on the y-axis again so that it's wrapping around properly. Now suddenly, so you can see it wrapped all around there. So, doesn't look awesome in the background, but that's not my purpose right now. My purpose is to get something that can reflect in this image, and that's what I have. Let me just turn that off for a moment and show you the difference. So this doesn't look really metallic at all. You kind of see a little bit of reflection at the edge. As soon as you turn on something for it to actually reflect, it starts feeling highly metallic. And even more so if you move around the image. So that's one way to create a material that's looking pretty highly reflective. Now we can still hide our background. That's a pretty easy trick. We may not want to see that background in there. We may just want to look at our object. The background may be distracting. Very easy to resolve. Here's a trick I use for that all the time. I'll simply pop into Modeler and I'll make a ball. I'll type N, the numeric, to get the default 1 meter ball. I'm actually going to make that 1,000 meters on all axes. I'm going to drop the tool with a space bar, Shift A to show the whole thing. This should be in perspective view. So there's my ball. But I want it to be an inside out ball so that it blocks out. I'm going to put this around my mech and block out the backdrop. So the normals need to be facing in the other direction. You can see if I select a couple of polygons, you can see that you can't actually. My show normals is turned off there. You can see the normals are facing outward. I want them to be facing inward. So I'm going to flip all the normals by just typing the F key. Now I have an inside out ball. I'm going to give it a surface name, black underscore ball. And I can set its initial color right here. I can set it to black by dragging these all down, or I can right click this to get into HSV mode, hue, saturation, and value. Now just an aside on that for a moment, if you are an artist, you should be working in HSV and thinking in HSV. And the reason is RGB is a mathematical expression of color on your computer monitor. And HSV is a human expression of color on your computer monitor. We think of colors in terms of their hues, in terms of their saturations, and in terms of their values. So if you're not already thinking in and using HSV, I strongly recommend you look into it and learn it. So I'm going to turn the value down to 0, which will make this black. Because I'm going to make my background black. Go OK. So now I have this black ball. I have to save it as to save the object. I'm just going to save it as black ball, and I'm going to send it right over to layout. Send object to layout. It'll pop in there in just a second. Okay, my black ball is in there, and you'll notice that the whole scene has gone black. The reason for that is it's polygon, so it's casting shadows, and it's solid, so it's preventing any reflections getting to our object. Easy enough to solve. I can go into my scene editor, and there's my black ball there. I want to open its properties. Go to the render tab, turn off cast shadow. Now the light is getting through the ball because the ball is no longer casting shadows. We'll just turn off self shadow and receive shadow just in case. It's probably not necessary. Now we want our reflections to get through, so we'll make the ball unseen by rays. And by rays, in this case, what we mean is ray traced reflection is now able to go through this object, this black ball. Now we can easily hide the ball by making it unseen by camera. The ball's still there, but now the camera won't see it. We could make it unseen by radiosity. we can make it unaffected by fog. But for now, all we need is for it not to cast shadows and for it to be unseen by ray traced reflections from the background. So we get the benefits of an environment that we can reflect into our reflective materials. Plus, we still get to have a background that is whatever color we want, or we could put an image onto it. Again, a different image. We can make it whatever image we want. We could also apply a gradient to it, or a procedural texture, or whatever texture we want, because this is now a piece of geometry in the background. Now, this visor material is looking a lot better, but it's a little over diffuse to me. I kind of feel like it should be a darker material. That's an aesthetic choice for me. So I'm going to open my surface editor again. Go to my visor material right here, and I'm going to look at the diffuse value. I like to bring the diffuse value down, make it a little bit darker. And by turning down diffuse, what we're saying is we're letting less light bounce off this. More light is being absorbed and less light is being bounced off. This is pretty much exactly the same as these three color values, except the difference is that you can adjust the amount of light being absorbed and reflected in individual RGB values, or you can do it in all three at once by using the diffuse value. So for example, if this was white, 255, 255, 255, and I cut that down to half of that, which is something like, well, it's 128, 128, 128, that would be the same as leaving this at 255, 255, 255 and setting this to 50%. The end value would be the same because these get multiplied together. In this case, I've actually put in a color map which overrides these color values except in these two areas. And I want to turn down the diffuse value of all three together. So I can actually just turn down my diffuse. And that's darkening down all three. You know what? That's not actually doing what I want it to do. I'd like to just affect the really shiny metallic one, so I'm going to turn this up. And I want to turn down the diffuse value of just these two. Well, I'm going to have to either figure out how to manipulate all three of these together, or I can right click on it and I can just turn down the value. So I'm turning down the value. Now you'll see what that does is it's actually losing some of the color highlights. And I can actually push some of that color back in by going back to my advanced tab and turning my color highlights up to maybe 25%. That brings a bit of the color back in, as you can see. I'm actually just going to add a little more color saturation to my color. That's helpful as well. That's starting to feel pretty good. That feels like a nice gold reflective color. I'm pretty happy with that for now. I'll probably come back and do a little bit more refinement later, but I want to bring everything else up to at least a decent layer before, decent level altogether before I go back and really start tweaking. So since I'm happy with that material, the first thing I want to do is save my object and my scene. So I'm going to go down here and say save all objects. Some people recommend that you never ever use save all objects. That's quite a debate. Personally, I use save all objects all of the time because I'm very methodical about what I do, and I know when I ask to save all objects is because I know I want to save everything that I've done. You may prefer to simply save the currently selected object. It's probably a good idea when you first start out so you don't accidentally overwrite anything. But I'm going to save all objects, and I'm also going to save my scene. So I can do that from here, or I could just type the S key to save as well. Actually, just before we carry on, I'd like to really demonstrate the difference between a simple low-res JPEG spherically mapped in the background and an actual spherical HDR image. Now, one of the disadvantages to just putting any old JPEG in the background, even though it's a panoramic image, is that at the top of the sphere, it's going to be pinched together, and you can see that right here. This looks like it might be a geometry error, but this is really our image pinching together directly above, and it's being reflected. So we see an error in our image in that, and that could potentially be painted out. But there's another issue, and that is because this is a low-range image, all of the color values are between 0 and 1 in floating point values, or 0 and 255 in RGB values. Real illumination, of course, goes much higher than that, and that's where HDR images come in. They contain illumination values that are more real worldly, that are much higher than 1.0. And 1.0 is the limit in low range images because that's what your computer monitor is able to display, from black to white and nothing beyond that. A white piece of paper in your house looks white, but when you take it outside, it's white plus way brighter. So we know that we need values much higher than simple low range JPEGs, and thus HDRs were invented. So let's go ahead and drop an HDR into our backdrop. This particular HDR was spherically mapped. In other words, it was captured by taking a camera and aiming it at a reflective sphere, and then taking a whole bunch of exposures of that and putting them together in HDR Shop to create a single .HDR image with multiple exposures in it. We'll just look at the image editor. I've actually loaded it up. This is the image here. I've just found this on the internet, and I'm sure you can find this image and other images like it that are just floating around there available for you to play with. Because we're looking at this on a computer monitor, these areas seem to be really clipped to white. They aren't really. They actually contain values much higher than computer monitor white. It's just that we can't see them on this computer monitor, but the net result is we're going to see way more interesting values in our reflections. And if we also use this to illuminate our scene, we're actually going to get directional lighting out of some of these values, and probably specifically down here where the sun is peeking between these trees, the values are probably really high. So we'd probably get a direction from there. So I'll close this. I'll go to my backdrop options right now, and I'm going to drop that HDR into my textured environment. Here I have this panoramic image that I found and said I'm going to put this is called the RNL probe. Watch the reflection values here when I switch this to the HDR image. See how much brighter the reflections are and how much more realistic it appears. And also we don't have our little pole at the top of our spherically mapped image. As a matter of fact, there's an even better way to apply the HDR in the backdrop, and I should show you that right now. I'm actually just going to remove this. There's a special plugin here called Image World that's designed especially for HDRs, and will map them correctly without having to set any axes or anything. So that's done. Very simple. It's correctly in there, and you can see really beautiful reflective values in there. So maybe we'll leave that in. That's looking really nice. We're actually starting to see some reflection elsewhere as well, because there is a reflection map on all of this geometry, and it's various bits and pieces of it are partially reflective wherever our we'll just look at our reflection map here. Wherever our reflection map is not completely black, which is lots of places, just lots of gray, and there's some bits and pieces of white, and there's some nice highlights here where we're going to get real reflections happening in there. So there's some nice complexity to this reflection map as well, and we're starting to see that in bits and pieces here and there. There's one more important point to note about applying a color map to this UV set, and this is related to bringing models from other softwares and also to working inside Lightwave. So let's look at our mech object, and I want to take a peek at the UV map here. So go to UV. Actually just want to look at the UV set by itself. And you'll see that the UV set is all polygonal still. However, we have subdivided our model. So there's a problem with having your UV set still polygonal and your model subdivided. And what it means is that the textures aren't going to quite line up exactly on the subdivided model. So we need to actually switch this UV map to subdivided. That's easy enough. We go to our Windows Vertex Maps panel, and we'll look in our textures. There's our mech UV map, and we can see that the interpolation is currently set to linear. If we click on it, we have this option. We're going to go to subpatch, and we'll see a change in our UV map. Now our UVs also all look subpatched, and now that means that our textures are all going to line up better. Looking up here, we see the asterisk beside the object mech02, and that means that it's changed since we've saved it last. I'm going to save it. Simply type the S key, pause, the asterisk goes away, showing us that the changes we've just been made have been saved, so we can pop back into layout. And since our modeler and layout are connected via the hub, we don't have to reload the object. By the time we get here, layout is loading this, and it should be here with us shortly. Okay, so there we go, it's popped in. And you may have noticed up here there was some texture stretching before we subd'd the UVs, and now that's all resolved. There's actually a little bit of stretching here and there. Now that our object is subd'd and our UV set is also subd'd, those stretching issues are fixed. Okay, next I'm going to take a look at our first layer of armor. Here's our first layer of armor. Let's just identify it by turning luminosity up. This is armor, our first layer of armor. And there's other ones. Armor 2 is some other bits and pieces here and there. And same with armor 3 and 4. So they're distributed around so we can do slight variations and make the armor a little bit more interesting than all one value. So here's our armor 1. This is the main bulk of the body armor. So the first thing I'm going to do with that armor is I'm going to turn on smoothing. Get it nice and smooth. And the second thing I'm going to do is move away from our layer editor into our node editor. I'm going to reconstruct this in nodes. So I'm going to turn on nodes, and what will happen is here's our root node, and every channel that I hook up with a root node will take over the channels in here. These will become grayed out. For example, when I add image to set what the image node is in here, there's two ways to do it. I can either double click this to open up its panel and find all of the values, or this arrow over here, I can open it up, and whatever my currently selected node is, the controls will appear here. Personally, I like a smaller panel, and I like to keep things as small as I can, so I like to just double click to see what my current one is. Now for my color channel, this image is going to be for my color channel of my surface. I want to use my Komodo Color 2, and I'm simply going to plug my color map in there. That's good enough for me for now. I'm not interested in any of the rest of these controls right now, so I'm just going to collapse this to image 1. Now when we go back, we'll see that the color channel is grayed out in our layer editor here. So the values that we set in here still exist, and we can access and change them if we turn off nodes. But whenever nodes is on, the nodes input takes over, and we can see the difference here. I haven't actually set up the UV set or the projection type for the armor, so we can see that there is a difference between the two. So let's go in here, we'll open this up. The image, we want to set its mapping to UV map, just like in the texture editor. We know the name of the UV set is mech UV, and now when we look back here, we'll see that the armor is correctly textured in exactly the same way it was in the layer editor. So we're going to go ahead and add the specularity, reflection, and bump maps as well to this one. So I'm going to need again another image, and I'm going to need two more. So I'm going to Control C to copy and paste, Control V twice. So now I have 4 images. This one is going to be my spec gray. I also want it to be UV map mech UV, and I'll plug its luma into specularity and collapse it. Image 3 is going to be my reflection. Double click it. Image is Komodo reflection gray. Again, UV projection mech UV, and I'll connect its luma to the reflection channel and collapse it. And the last one will be our bump map. Once again, Komodo bump gray, UV map mech UV, and I'll connect its bump channel to bump, and again collapse it just to keep it nice and clean. Now, as we connected those, we may have noticed back in our layer editor those channels became grayed out. So that's a very easy way to know at a glance that we have nodes happening. And please don't forget to turn this checkbox on. You can build a crazy, incredible network in here, but you'll never see it unless you remember to turn that on. So let's take a look at our material. We basically have set up exactly the same thing that we had in the layer editor, so it looks the same. And now we're going to go ahead and make a few adjustments. So let me just close this. For the main armor, I'd actually like this to feel a little bit more desaturated. It feels a little bit too shiny green for my liking, but I don't want everything else to lose its color. So there's a pretty easy way to do that. I can go to my image editor, go to my color 2 map, and I can clone it. So now I have a second one. Now that I have the second image, I can actually edit it, and I can reduce its saturation right here. Make a less saturated green. Okay, this Komodo O2 Targa 1 is not currently assigned, so I can actually go into my armor, open up the control panel for this node, and switch this to my new value. And now we can see that this armor is a little bit desaturated. I can actually even go into my image editor and work right in the VPR to change my saturation, see how it's working for me. That's a little bit better. If I wanted to, I could change hue, actually change the color of my map, and that'll update right in VPR. As a matter of fact, I kind of like that color a little bit better, so I think I'm going to go with that color. And the cool thing here is I'm not opening up this image map in Photoshop and I'm not changing its color. I'm using one single original image map. So I can have each of these different armor materials a different color, but I don't have to have multiple image maps loaded. This is a pretty massive memory saving. Okay, well that'll do for this material for the moment. Let's just go ahead and look at our armor layer 2. So armor 2 I'm going to identify again by cranking my luminosity. It's those bits and pieces. Okay. I've decided to go with this kind of pale blue color instead of the green color. So I'm going to start simply by copying this, dropping it right onto my armor 2. Now I'd like these to stand out a little bit differently. And one of the ways I can do that is by changing the diffuse value. So I can continue to work and I can dial my diffuse right here, make it a little bit darker, which gives it a little bit of interest. Or I can go back into my node editor and I can put a value onto my diffuse input. And that's pretty straightforward. Simply go to add node, add a constant. In this case we want to use a scalar, which gives us decimal value, you can see. By double clicking it, we open up its panel and we see that the scalar value is set by default at 1.0, which means that we can go up and down with it. You notice there's also an envelope here, so we can actually animate the value over time if we wish. We don't wish to in this time. At this time, I put an envelope on this, so I want to get rid of it, so I just shift click to get rid of the envelope. First I'm going to actually connect to the scalar to my diffuse channel. I'm actually just going to move this. Personally, I prefer not to have overlapping lines in my network if I can avoid it. Yeah, obviously when you get into complex networks you can't avoid it, but to begin with it makes it just a lot easier to see things. I'll double click it and I'll just turn my value down, my scalar value, so this is just like turning down the diffuse value in the layers panel. I'll just turn this down and watch my value change in my VPR until I'm satisfied with what it looks like. It's starting to get a little bit darker. All we need is a little bit of variation to make it feel like it's something else. So somewhere around there is good. Now I'd like this piece to be kind of flat and not reflective. But reflection is applied to it. So pretty straight ahead, I can either simply turn off reflection by disconnecting that, and I probably actually should disconnect specular as well to take the specular highlights off of it. And of course, since I've disconnected reflection and specular from this node system, it means that those channels are now taking their values from the layer-based system. So let's just go back to the layers here, and we have spec and reflection. So I'll just shift click to remove those two textures. And now you can see that these are really flat. Well, I don't really want them to be quite that flat. So we'll go back into our nodes. I'm actually going to just connect specularity. That'll give it a bit of spec back without the image reflection, so it feels a little bit more matte. Actually, now that we've taken our reflection specularity off, my diffuse is a little bit too low. I'm going to bring that back up a little bit. I don't want it to stand out too much. I just want it to feel like a slightly different material. Something in that range feels pretty good. So it feels a little bit more matte and a little bit less metallic than the other materials. The variation from one material, especially in a model like this, is going to give it a lot of interesting complexity. So let's next look at what our armor 3 is. Armor 3 is some bits and pieces here. What's armor 4 here? Okay, let's play with our armor 4 here. I'm actually going to take our armor 2 texture, the dark one that we just made. I'm going to copy it, paste it onto armor 4. So now we have that darkness all over everything, and I'm actually going to drop its diffuse value even more. So let me just go into the node editor for that, open up my scalar value for diffuse, and turn it down. No, that's way too far. I don't want it to be black, but I do want to give it some nice contrast. We'll start somewhere in there, and then we'll look at the whole model later and see how that feels to us. And I'm going to do the same thing back. I'm going to take my new armor 4 that I've done, and I'm going to paste it back onto armor 3, and that should just about cover our green materials, except for the backpack, which we'll get to shortly. So for our armor 3, let's just find out what those are here. Okay. It's actually feeling not too bad for now. So right now our armor 3 and armor 4 are the same. I'm just going to leave those now. We'll back off on our image and take an overall look at it and see how it's feeling to us. Okay. Before we move on, I think I really need to get rid of that green in there. So I'm going to just go ahead and take our armor 1, copy it. It needs to go, looks like it needs to go on the gun barrels, gun body, backpack. Let's see if that covers it. Yeah, it should cover it for now. And before we get into any more texturing, I think we're going to need more than just, we just have the default distant light in here. It's making it pretty difficult for us to see the model very well. So I'm going to go ahead and put a little bit better lighting in it. So let's just see if we can zoom in on this guy and get a good decent view at him. Turn him around a little bit. Okay, it's interesting on the back where there isn't any light, we can still see some reflections. So that actually gives some illumination to the back side of this, even though it's in darkness. And that's a real power of reflections that you shouldn't forget. Even though material may not be directly illuminated, if it's reflective and you have a reflective environment, which you always should if you have reflective metals or reflective glass, for example, there's going to be illumination from just the reflection. And actually, when we take a moment to think about that, all indirect lighting is simply light reflection anyways. So it makes sense. So let's just take a view of this guy from the front again and see if we can improve his light a little bit. Direct light from one side is fine from now. We'll go into a quad view and insert use a spotlight for now for fill light, just for quick interactivity. I'll call it fill. I'm actually going to look through the light view so I can reposition this. And I want it to be kind of opposite where the key light is, which is our distant light over here. We're getting a little bit of fill into the other side. And I'm actually going to leave both of these lights white for now. The reason is I don't want to get any false impressions about what my colors look like, because I'm texturing now. I'd like to texture under a pretty pure white environment. So I can go ahead and change intensities, and in fact, any second lights, any additional lights that you add to the scene by default come in at 50%. You can see that by opening the light's properties. This light, which I called fill, automatically came in at 50%, and the original light, which I'm actually going to rename key, is at 100% by default. So by default we get a distant light in there at 100%. It's just called light. I renamed it to key. And by default actually we have ambient intensity at 5%. I'm going to turn that off as well because that can tend to fool us. Ambient intensity is actually a pretty bad way to try to get photorealistic lighting. It is wise to leave ambient intensity at maybe 0.05%. And the reason for that is it means that ambient intensity isn't really going to be visible in your render, but it also means that in your render no pixel will ever be zero black. And this is pretty crucial when you're taking your image and manipulating them in a compositing package, because a lot of compositing operations will multiply values. For example, if they say lift the image, they're going to grab all the values and multiply them together. And if you have zero black pixels in your frame, 0 multiplied by anything is still 0. So black will stay pitch black, and it will crunch down to these really ugly black chunky areas in your image. So it's always advisable to keep ambient intensity at a low enough value that it's not visible, because believe me, ambient intensity is not your friend if you're trying to make photorealistic images. However, it is your friend in terms of avoiding zero blacks anywhere in your image, and you really want to avoid those at all cost. So we'll leave our ambient intensity at 0.05. Key is at 100. Our fill light is at 50%, and that'll do for now. For the purposes of our creating this texture, that'll do just fine for now. I'm actually really enjoying playing with this VPR in Lightwave 10. Looking at this full body now, I'm finding our base armor to be too reflective to be really beat up armor. You'll see what I mean when I move around it. It looks almost polished, yet it's, the material's all chipped. You can see if we zoom in here, it's all chipped and it's beaten up, but it's shiny as though it's had a layer of wax put over it after it was all beat up. I guess this soldier likes to take care of his armor, but it doesn't really feel that realistic. So I'd like to actually turn down the reflective value of that armor. So I'm going to do a little something about the reflection on this armor. And again, just to remind you where the armor is, we'll turn up its luminosity. So that's most of the body. Is just too highly reflective, and it may also be that the reflection is too sharp, so we can see if we can blur that reflection out a little bit, soften it, like you might see on brushed metal or beaten up metal or whatever. So open the node editor here. I'm actually just going to move it over so we can see our material a little bit better while we're working on it. And we want to do something with our reflection channel. So we could actually add a shader. We can go into our reflection shaders, add a reflections shader, and we're going to take its output and we're going to connect that to the reflection channel, and that's disconnecting this image, the reflection map. So to get at all the inputs, we can either plug things in here, or we can open it up and set our values manually. So we want the mode to be ray tracing and backdrop. It can be backdrop only. In other words, it won't ray trace reflections of local geometry. It can be spherical map only, in which case we can put in a map like our panoramic image that will now reflect in there, or our HDR image, in which case it's no longer ray tracing. So you can actually get reflections without ray tracing, although it will now not reflect any of the local geometry. If you want photoreal, the best thing is to use ray tracing and backdrop, and then we don't need this image at all. And we would like the blue of our armor to come through this reflection, so we want to turn on tint reflections. You can see that just dropped down into blue a little bit. Now we also want to blur our reflections. They're too bright, but we'll get to that in a minute. But they're also too sharp. So let's see if we can blur them. Let's just set this up to 50%. And that should soften out the image reflections in there. And you know what? It's actually a little bit difficult seeing the reflection in there because the light intensity of the reflection is too high. This is a function of using the HDR, and you may remember earlier on I advised against using an HDR because of the overblown values. This is exactly what I meant. So we could go back to using a low range image. What I'd prefer to do though is show you how to control that level of intensity here. So the issue is that the values that are coming out of the shader are too high. All we have to do is simply add a mult node in here so we can multiply it down. We'll go add node, math, scalar, and there's a multiply node here. Now you'll notice that there is also a vector multiply if you look under math vector mult. And this, when you open it up, you'll see it refers to multiplying in 3 different channels. For example, in XYZ or HPB or RGB. That's not what we want here. We want to use this scalar one. We're going to take our output and we're going to plug it into one side of this mult node. Let me just move this back here so we can see it better. We're going to take the result and push it into reflections. You'll see that reflections go off, and that's because nothing is plugged into here right now. I could take a scalar and I could plug it into there and then run my scalar, or I can simply just double click this mult and I can see that the B input value, I can set it right here. It's set to 0. If I set it to 1, what we're saying is this multiplied by 1. So what we have right now is the original value. This times 1 is the result. We just simply want to bring this down, so simply take our B value and turn it down. Let's just try 0.5 to start with and see if that's helpful. It is a little bit helpful, but I don't think it comes down far enough. So I've gone ahead and found a good value. About 0.05 works. Now, that might seem like a really low value to you, and it would be if we were using a low range image, but what you have to remember is that the HDR image in the background has way higher values by orders of magnitude. So in order to bring that down under control in our reflections, we actually really need to turn this down quite low, and that's actually looking and feeling pretty good to me. I'm going to turn up my reflection blur. I'd like this to be a little bit blurrier. I'll try 75% and see how that feels. Well, that's not too bad. I think I am going to go, now that I've broadened my reflections a little bit, I think I am going to go back to my mult and I'm going to turn this down to 0.03 just to get an even lower value in there. And that's feeling pretty good to me. Okay, so I look at this image and I ask myself, what's the thing that bothers me the most in this image? And this is how I approach doing all my work. I look at the image and I'm like, what is the biggest thing that bothers me? Right now, the biggest thing bothering me is these cables. So I'm going to do that next. And just talking about that workflow, about what's the biggest thing, that's a really advisable workflow, no matter what medium you're working in, no matter what your task is. If you look at the big things and always deal with the big things, ignore the tiny details, work your way down to the tiny details, you'll find yourself working a lot more efficiently. Because often if you get bogged down in tiny details without having changed the large things yet, you'll find yourself having to go back, change the large things, and then redo the details again anyway. So let's take a look at these cables. I wonder what we can do interesting with these cables. Let's look at that material here. Cables. Okay, so we've put it in the layer editor. I'm going to do nodes again. And I'd like to do this a little bit more quickly than last time. And using a really nice automated feature inside a Lightwave node-based layer system, the node editor. So I'm going to use a material. And in this case, I'm going to use car paint. The reason I'm going to use car paint is because I would like these cables not to feel like dirty, greasy cables, but to feel like something really super high tech. These are armored cables. They have sensitive wires going through them, and they should be some mega super strong material to protect all that control system. So in order to hook up this material, first of all, it comes in as a default kind of metallic red car paint, and I'll hook it up simply by connecting that. Now all those cables are going to go into this shiny metallic red paint. That's not what I want, that's not what I envision for this, but it's a good start. I actually envision kind of a cold blue metallic metal. So I'm going to double click this to open up its settings, and the first thing I'm going to do is find a color that really suits me. And I'm thinking of a kind of a deep blue. Something that might make it feel a little like a really unusual metal. It's kind of a bluey purpley. It's a little oversaturated, so I'm going to right click to go to HSV, and I'm going to just turn down saturation on it. See if I can get it to feel a little steely. One of the issues with picking this color is that I have a kind of a faded, desaturated armor, and I don't want something that's going to totally overpower it in terms of its brightness. So the kind of metal feels is pretty interesting, but it's too bright, so I'm going to turn its value down. The value is brightness and darkness. I'm going to bring down its value, try and drop it into the shadows and make it not quite so obtrusive. Let me just back out a little bit so we can get a clearer view. A little too red. There we go. That's kind of an interesting blue material in there. And it's feeling pretty high tech to me. And it's also, the light's going to play across it really beautifully when it rotates. Of course, we'll do a render and a rotation. We need to really look at this in motion to see how it's really going to play, but that's not a bad first guess. You may notice that I'm kind of starting to whip through these materials. The reason is spending too much time on a single material is a recipe for wasting your time. The best idea is to quickly put together materials that are kind of in the ballpark of what you imagined, then do a render in motion, not a single frame. A single frame will not give you the information you need. You need to see this thing in motion. You either need to rotate it or you need to spin the camera around it. I'd recommend that you actually leave a light stationary and leave the camera stationary and rotate it, because that way you get to see the light playing across its surfaces as it rotates. And that's really going to tell you how your materials are working. So let's see what other materials we have left here. It looks like we still need to look at the ammo belt, the backpack, debris will be later. Inner glass is not visible right now, so we're not going to look at that right now. Ground we'll do in a bit. We'll need to look at the gun barrels, the gun body. The hand here is still untextured. Definitely we need to look at that. Muzzle flash we're actually going to do when we get to lighting the scene. Rocks will be later, and we've done the visor. So let's take a look at the gun. I'll just reposition this. Okay, looking at the texture on the gun here, this is not a bad texture. It kind of matches up with everything else, but I kind of feel like I'd like to put maybe a kind of a camouflage texture on here. You know, the kind of industrial camouflage you sometimes see on real military weapons. So I'm going to find I'm going to look at the gun body. I'm going to find the gun body material. Here it is, and it's hooked up to nodes. I'll open nodes, and I want to make an adjustment to the color values. I basically want to add another layer to this color so that it feels a little bit more like camouflage and not just a painted texture that's chipped and cracked. So that's pretty straight ahead. I can apply a procedural texture over this that'll give us that kind of camouflage breakup. For example, let's have a look here and see what we have. Flakes might do just the thing. As you can see, it kind of gives kind of that breaky uppy kind of thing. Let's just plug that into the color channel and see what it'll probably go pretty dark here. Okay, so we can see that looks like the camouflage, kind of an interesting camouflage. Let me just play with the scale here a little bit. I'll go half scale and see if that looks any better. Half a meter. Maybe 3/4. Okay, that feels pretty interesting, but I don't want to have that just by itself. I want to multiply that with my color value. So now what I have is this, and I want to multiply it by this. I want to put them both together. Well, I've already said the answer. I need to multiply, so I'm going to add a multiply node. Now remember earlier we were talking about scalar and vector mults. This one's going to be a vector because it has 3 channels. It has a RGB channel, so we want to multiply all 3 of those together. So go back to math, vector, multiply. So take the color value, put it in. What happened was this went back to the original green texture that's in the layer editor because I've disconnected the color. So once we hook this back up, that'll come back. I'm going to take this color, I'm going to plug it in. Now we have this flake value multiplied by the color value that's applied, and once I hook it up to the color texture, you'll see now that we have our original color texture that's multiplied by this kind of camouflagey procedural texture, and that adds a little bit more interest to the metal. And actually that's really interesting. Maybe I should actually add that to the, well, I'll think about that. I might add that to the whole body, or I might do that as an alternate. Okay, so let me just rotate around here so we can get another look at the other side of the gun. Yep, that's kind of interesting. Okay, next, I think I'd like to give our ammo belt a little bit of flash. Now, this is a pretty old, beat up looking kind of ammo belt. You know, I'm kind of thinking I want to suggest a bit of a contrast to everything else that's all beaten and scratched. Maybe, you know, maybe this ammo belt is brand new. Maybe the soldier is you know, 2 years out of training, but the ammo belt has just arrived in new shipment. So let's clean that ammo belt up a little bit. So we'll go to our ammo belt here, and I'd like to give it a kind of a nice fresh brassy texture, and then maybe once we get a nice brass on there, we'll munge it up a little bit. So let's apply nodes to this material. We can actually grab our armor and copy it into ammo belt to begin with, since all the UV maps are the same. And we can probably just disconnect everything here. So I'm going to start fresh, actually. Except I think I'll leave the bump in. So now to plug the color into the nodes, I need to add a constant color. Plug that straight in, and I need a brassy color. So once again, I'll double click this to pick my color, and I'm going to look for something, that's not quite right. Maybe something in the goldy brassy range. Brass can range pretty far. That's too orange. It needs to be a little bit more green than that, I think. Feel a little bit like brass. And we're definitely going to need some reflection on here. So let's apply a constant. Let's apply a constant for our reflection value. So double click that. It's set at 1. So I can just connect that right up, and that'll make it 100% reflective right now. And when we set our reflection pretty high, I mean, I'm going to adjust this later. Right now it's at 100%, but when the reflection is at 100% and the diffuse is at the value that's set, the diffuse channel's at 100% as well. So what this brass is really doing right now is reflecting 100% of the light twice. So this brass is twice as bright as it actually should be. 100% diffuse plus 100% reflection from the node panel. So we can either just change this right here, but I often find it's better to try to keep all of your values, all of your parameters in one panel. So I'm going to connect another scalar to the diffuse. I can actually just copy and paste this one to add another scalar, and I'll connect that up to diffuse. I'm going to set that to 0 to begin with, just as a ballpark. and that's giving us a sense of just the reflective highlights. Now, one of the odd disadvantages to this shading system is that when you turn diffuse down, you really lose the color value that should be in the reflection. So we can go back to our advanced tab, turn up our color highlights to bring the color back, even though it's reflective. We don't want it to be too bright, and you know what? It's just too reflective. I'm actually going to turn it down. Back to my edit nodes. I'll turn this down to maybe 75% to start with. Okay, that's not too bad in terms of values. And I'm going to grunge it up with a procedural texture as well. So again, I'm going to use a multiply node, and I'm going to multiply a procedural into my reflection, so that should break up the reflection a little bit. So let's try, for example, this time let's just try a hybrid multifractal. So that's your kind of fractal noise type, and we're going to need another vector mult in here. Vector multiply node. So we'll multiply this color by this value, and we'll put the result into reflection. And what we're ending up with is some reflection that's kind of broken up, except that this fractal noise is pretty large. So let's tighten it up and make a smaller procedural texture. I'll go by a 1/10 right now, and there we can see a little bit of broken up munge among the fairly shiny brass. Actually, it's a little too dark in there for my liking. So I'm going to reduce this black color to a gray. That should bring up some of the really dark areas, make it not so obvious. That's starting to feel pretty good. Yeah, it's a little bit broken up, not too shabby. Now that I see this resolving, I see it's taking down the reflectivity overall. So I think what I'd like to do is sharpen up the contrast in this fractal. And I can do that by taking my foreground color, right-clicking, and turning the value until it's white. And I'm actually going to take this value, I know I brought it up a little bit, I'm going to bring it down, and I think I'm going to go for a finer, even finer texture to try to break that up a little more. So right now I'm going to set it to 10 millimeters in the scale on all axes, and see what that's doing for us in here. I'll just wait a moment for this to resolve and take a peek. Okay, we can see the really fine noise in there. That's definitely too small. I'm looking for more smears and smudges than a texturing on the brass, so I've definitely gone too small. So I'll go back up to 50 millimeters. See how that feels. That's feeling a little bit better. So let's back off in this model and see what we've got so far. Take a look, see if we can get the whole thing in here. And look at our surface editor to see if we've missed anything. belt armor, backpack, cables. We haven't done any of the ground or debris yet. I'm looking at this whole thing, that those blue cables are looking still a little too color saturated to match up with everything else. So I'm actually going to pop back into those cables and make a slight adjustment. I'm going to desaturate that color a bit. A little more yet. Again, this starts with RGB. I'm going to right click it to get hue saturation value. I'm just going to turn my saturation down a little bit more. See if I can get that seated in there just right. Maybe bringing the value down a little bit more will help as well. Okay, that's starting to look interesting. Right, so the biggest thing sticking out right now here is the hand. So let's look at our hand surface and make sure we have all the polygons included in there, all the geo. Again, we'll crank up our luminosity to see it. Yep, that's definitely our hand material. Now I kind of feel like the hand should basically match up with this color here, although it doesn't seem to be mapped that way in the image map. So I'll turn on my nodes, go back to add a node, constant color. I'm Let's see if I can dial that color in. Let's see, so somewhere in this range. Let's see how that's looking. Obviously way oversaturated. Turn our sat down and turn our value down. Looks to me like we need to add a little bit of green to that to match it up. This is where RGB comes in handy. Okay, that's getting fairly close. I need to bring my value down a little bit. And I think we're going to need to put a little bit of procedural dirt on there as well. So I'll add, again, I'll go to the 3D texture and I'll add that hybrid multifractal again. And I'm going to plug its color into the diffuse channel. And by default, it scales 1 meter. So I'm going to take that value down to 1/10 of what it is. Okay, and the overlaying this fractal noise over this has really brought the value down, so I'll go back to the color value and bring its value up a little bit, see if I can compensate, and that should do the trick. Looks like it needs a little bit of reflectivity on it as well to match up with everything else in the armor. So let's actually take this and plug it also into the reflection node, or the reflection input rather. Okay, so it's time to turn this around and take a look at the backpack. I'm going to have to rotate my key light to get a better look at this backpack. There we go. That's actually in not too bad shape. I would like to find out what these kind of jetpack things are on the side because they feel untextured and I don't like that. So let's see if we can find out what material that is. I think that's one of the armors. Is it armor 4? No, it's not. Armor 3? Nope. Armor 2? Yes, indeed. This is part of armor 2. So let's see if we can see all the parts that are involved in armor 2. Looks like it's just a few bits and pieces, mainly these back and side bits. So I could go ahead and I'll just turn the luminosity down on this. I could go ahead and paint a texture for this, add it into the texture map. However, I really kind of like what we did with the camouflage stuff over there. So I'm going to drop into the nodes and add the camouflage effect to armor 2. Edit nodes. So we want to multiply our color by, it was 3D texture was flakes, I believe. Yep, that looks right. And we need a vector mult node. Math, vector, multiply. So we want to take the output of the flakes. We want to take the output of the color image and multiply them together. And the output is going to go into the color channel. Okay, so that's already kind of interesting. I think I'm going to scale this down again, maybe half. There we go. That's actually feeling pretty interesting. That feels good. Okay, I'll just double check over all my materials again and make sure I've covered it. We'll do the ground later. I think that's everything I want to do for now. So I think we're ready to start lighting this dude up. Okay, we're ready to start lighting this guy up, and the process is going to be that we're going to add some light and light him up and make him look nice, and then we're going to generate a turntable of him, and at that point we're going to re-evaluate all our materials and see what's working, what isn't working, what we need to go back and tweak. So we're not going to need the surface editor anymore for now. We are going to need to see the rest of the objects that are in the scene. So I'll open up the scene editor and I'll turn back on the base, the rocks, and we're not going to use the muzzle flash at the moment, but I'll turn the debris back on. Muzzle flash will be one of our final lighting refinements when we get to it. Okay, so let's just take a look at this guy. Alright, so to begin with, you may notice that he's backlit, so I'll grab our key light and swing it around again. Just a little bit more front lit, so we can see that everything's in there. We're going to texture the base and rocks and so forth later. But for now, I'm going to go to the top view, turn off my VPR just so I can set my light positions. To begin with, I'm going to roughly just stick my key light over here. My fill light needs to rotate to be illuminating our guy, and I'll actually just look through the light view there to make sure I've got him in. Not quite. Rotate him up. There we go, that should be decent. Just move him back a little bit, make sure I got the whole thing in there. And we need to position our camera. So go to the camera view. We haven't looked through the camera at all yet. I'll select the camera and I'll set it to the origin so that we can find our geo. There it is. And now I'm going to move the camera back into a starting position. Now here's a compositional note. I could simply put my object in the middle, rotate it and render it out, and it would look very nice. But I have the option to do a lot of other things. I don't have to just show this model as though it's in a showcase. I can give this piece a bit of attitude, a bit of emotional intent, something that'll key the viewer to give them some sort of a response to this picture rather than just viewing it and admiring its technical prowess. Because anytime you can create an image that evokes an emotional response in the viewer, in other words, brings them into the image, you've been far more successful as an artist than simply presenting your work in a way that shows that you can model and you can put textures on and you can turn some lights on. There's a big difference between the artist who composes well and creates beautiful, inspiring imagery and the artist who simply can fulfill all the technical requirements. There's a big difference between those two artists. So the intention of this subject matter seems to be that we want to show we have a very powerful figure here. Let me just turn off the wireframe so we can see him a little bit better. We have a really powerful figure here, and he's standing in some debris. He's probably in the middle of battle. So we want to give him a sense of power. And we can do that very easily with a camera. Here's a camera trick for you. If we position our camera, for example, so that we're looking down on our subject, it makes him feel small and diminished and less powerful in the image because the camera becomes our point of view into the picture. We're looking down on him. We have the high ground, so he's less powerful than we are. If we want the character to feel more powerful, all we have to do is the opposite. We move our camera down and simply point it upwards at him. And it doesn't have to be pointed upwards very much. Just a little bit will do it. And this really gives him some power and immensity in the image. You see how that feels? Now let's go to the extreme and see if we can make him feel really crazy powerful. And then beyond that, we can use wider lenses and have lens distortion and so forth happening in here. I'm actually going to frame this. I know there's going to be a muzzle flash coming out of here, so I'm going to frame this image so that the muzzle flash is going to be visible in the final render. This aspect, this 4:3 aspect, isn't going to do that for me. So I'm going to pick a high def aspect. So I'll open my camera properties. Here I have my regular perspective camera. In my resolution drop down, I have choices of a whole bunch of resolutions. It always defaults to 640 by 480. I'd like to pick a nice HDTV 1280 by 720, and that's going to change my aspect to 16:9, and you can see what the final image is going to be. And we'll move our camera over a little bit so that there's room, or we could actually rotate it over also. We don't have to move it. So there's going to be some room for that muzzle flash. It's going to be significant in this final composition. And I'm not really going to show the whole base down here because the base isn't really interesting. As a matter of fact, if I cut the frame off somewhere here, this implies that there's even more rubble out beyond here. So that's where I'm going to start with my initial camera positioning. So my camera positioning is going to help me determine where my initial light placement is going to be as well. I'm going to start with a simple key fill lighting technique. And what this means is I'm going to have a key light that's the primary illumination in the scene. I'm going to place it somewhere. Where I'm not going to place it is right next to the camera, because if I do that, the image is going to be really flat lit. And I'll show you exactly what I mean by that. I'm going to actually split this into a double wide frame. Actually, I don't want a quad, I want a double, so I'm just going to go over here and grab double vertical. And they're both going to be camera views, and I'm going to make one of them into a VPR. I go to my top view here. Going to grab my fill light that we put in earlier, and I'm going to turn it off so that it's not affecting the scene. And I'm going to grab my distant light. Now the actual position of a distant light in a scene doesn't matter, but I'm going to put it over here so you can see what I mean if this were a spotlight, for example. And I simply, actually I'll change it to a spotlight so you can see what we mean. Open its properties, switch it to a spotlight. Now I'm going to look through the spotlight view and aim it directly at the subject. Okay, so we can see the lighting on the subject, and it's very front flat lighting and incredibly boring. As an artist trying to create a really dramatically beautiful image, what you want to do is position your lights such that they show off all the shapes as much as possible. So I want you to see what happens when I move this light around to one side. I want you to watch how many forms come out of here that you can't really see very well just now. So I'll move this light over here and I'll shoot it in from the side. Maybe I'll bring it down from the top a little bit and try and get over that gun. Okay, so now we have an illuminated side and we have a shadowed side. We still see our reflections, but you can see how this is starting to make really dramatic lines, really beautiful dramatic lines. Let's try it from the other side and see what it looks like. It's a little bit too far to the front. I think it looks more dramatic on the other side. So let's put it back over there. Yeah, that feels pretty nice and dramatic. So this implies that there's some intense light source off to one side shining on our guy. Now, this light is set at 100%. And 100% is an intensity, but it's not the upper limit of your lighting intensity. You can set your light to 1,000,000% if you want. Of course, if we set this to 1,000,000%, everywhere that's illuminated is going to be completely overexposed. I'll show you what I mean. 1,000,000%, and all of this is totally overexposed. So that's not so good unless you decide to use some intensity fall off. And I love using inverse square fall off because what that does is it creates really natural fall off for lights. Lights are actually incredibly bright at their core, and the light intensity falls off very quickly. You need to turn your nominal distance down from 1 meter, because what we're saying right now is that the light is 1,000,000% 1 meter from the light. Most light filaments are in the 2 centimeter range, so let's just say 2 centimeters for this. And now we have a light that's behaving a lot more physically. It's going to be brighter closer to the light source and dimmer further away. And this is going to become particularly visible. Let me just close this light properties panel and show you what I mean. I'll look through the camera view here. So if I bring this light closer to the subject, you're going to see real intensity start to blast it. So you can see that it's much brighter now. Let me look through that light view again. Do you see that real intensity? That's pretty nice lighting. Okay, I'll just back it off a little bit. Get the whole light in. Get the whole model in there. Okay, so there's a key light that I'm interested in starting with. Now, this isn't showing off my textures as well as I want it to. So I'm going to need some fill to fill in a bit of this darkened area. I really want to show off this model. As a matter of fact, I don't think that key light is bright enough. So there's two things I can do. I can increase the light intensity, or I can increase the nominal distance. So let's just increase our nominal distance a little bit. Bring that light intensity up. See what happens. Okay, that's starting to feel like some pretty intense light. That feels a lot better. And let's take our fill light that we have in here and let's change it into something reasonable. Now, if I just do a spotlight, like my key light, all my shadows from my spotlight side are going to be nice and sharp and tight like the spotlight. I don't want that. I'd like to fill this in as though the light from the right hand side is diffused light. So I'm going to need a very large light source. I have a lot of options. I could put it in area light. I could put in a dome light. I could use backdrop radiosity. As a matter of fact, if I turn backdrop radiosity on, I already have a backdrop on, and that'll fill in a lot of light. Let's see what happens when we do that. I'll go to my render globals. I'm going to turn on enable radiosity. Well, at first glance, that looks kind of nice. But there's two problems. One is it's too even for me. I'm looking for something that's a little more dramatic than this. And I don't have as much directional and intensity control over it as I would like, because the fill light is driven by an HDRI image, which has really incredibly high values in very specific places in the image. And I need to know all that information to rotate it around, position things properly, and so forth. I could turn down my intensity. Let's try that. Maybe even 30%. And that's not too bad either. Although I'd be adding some more lights to provide some kickers here and there. However, I want more control than the HDRI image in the backdrop is going to allow me. So I'm actually going to turn that off. And instead, I'm going to put it in a light that gives me a little bit of directional control. And in this case, that's going to be an area light. So this fill light, for me, is going to become an area light. And I'm going to position it by looking at my perspective view to begin with. There it is. It's not really quite positioned right for me. I'll move it back here and look through the light view. And I'll scale it up. I'm going to need to look in my perspective view again to examine the scale. What a nice large light source. That's going to afford me some nice soft shadows as well. And of course I need to turn it back on. Okay, so as soon as we turned it on, we could see it's starting to fill in over here. And let's just turn it up so we can see what it's doing. As a matter of fact, let's go back to our key light and turn it off so that we can look at just our fill light. And another thing we can do, these reflections can be a little bit deceiving about where light is coming from, so we can actually go back to our render globals, to our render tab, and turn off ray trace reflection for now, just so we can focus on what this one fill light is doing where it's coming from. And it's starting to feel pretty nice and soft. I actually really like the line that it's making down here. But I might want to push it around to the back a little bit more. So let's go back to our light view. Select the fill light. And we'll push this back a little bit and see where that gets us. Maybe make it a little bit larger too. Okay. Okay. Now I want to give a sense of night here. So a really good trick for night is by creating a nice blue fill light. So let's see what we need to do here. This is definitely way too blue, so I'm going to right click on my RGB and I'm going to desaturate this a bit. Maybe a lot. It's a little too red. Well, it's starting to feel nightish. Let's add our key light back in and see how that's starting to feel to us. Okay, that's pretty decent. I still think our key light is not bright enough. So I'm going to up my nominal distance again to 70 millimeters. See if I can really push some exposure. That could be interesting. And now I'll turn our reflections back on. Back to the render globals. Ray trace reflection turn back on. And that's starting to come along nicely. Okay. One thing we're really going to need for this turntable, you notice how this right hand side is kind of falling into darkness. So I want to put a kicker in the back, also known as a rim light, to try and bring out this edge of our model. The left hand edge is already brought out by our key light, which is acting as a key slash edge rim. We're going to put another one in the right hand side. So we can also do that with a spotlight. I'm actually simply going to clone our key light with Control C with it selected. And I'm going to open the properties for this light. It's also called key because it's a second key light. I'm going to name it rim. And looking through the light view, I'm going to move it around the back side. And see if I can find a really good position. The tricky part with rims is finding just the right position to do what you want. And I think a key to positioning this light might be adding a little bit of color to it so that it's contrasting with the over bright white key light. So let's maybe add a little bit of warmth to one side, maybe indicating that the light source behind him is fire or something like that. So I'll open this light properties, go to my Kelvin color temperature scale and look for a nice fire color. See what that does for us. Well, that's pretty interesting. It provides quite a nice contrast to the blue fill light as well. Let's just let that resolve in VPR for a moment. Okay, before we send this for a nice turntable render, there's one more thing I want to do. We've added a nice key light and a nice fill light, nice colored rim light to bring it one other side. And the only thing missing is a little bit of bounce light. Now, I can turn on radiosity, but I painted myself into a little bit of a corner here by putting an HDR image in the background for all these reflections. I really wanted these reflection values. So if I turn on my radiosity, that HDR is going to illuminate the whole scene with its full values. It's going to become a much brighter scene, and I'll show you what happens now. If I enable radiosity, really lose the kind of a nighttime battle feel that we've been building up. So I don't want to do that, but I do want there to be bounce lighting coming up from underneath. And the solution is deceptively simple. It's what we've used for many years, and we're simply going to add a light and point it up at our character, maybe more than one. We'll see how it goes. Weapon of choice is going to be an area light. I'm going to call this bounce. It's a bounce light. And I'm going to go into the perspective view to position it. Now, looking at this scene and knowing that the key light is coming in here, I know that it's going to be hitting this slab of rock, and bouncing up. That's going to be the significant bounce. So let's just see. Let me just see if we can get in there. Get a nice close look and position that light well. So this is the piece of rock here that I'm talking about, that this massively bright light would be bouncing up and shining onto them. So the area light should be positioned as though it is this slab of rock. In other words, it needs to be planar with this rock, with this plane. So grab the light, move it up. I'm actually going to flatten it out so that it's all ready to go. Nice flat light. And I'll roughly position it so that it's taking the place of the top of that slab of rock. Let's see, it needs to be not quite flat, it needs to be about that angle. So that seems to be about right. Now I don't want this light illuminating the rocks, so I'm going to open its properties panel, go to the objects, and I'm going to exclude it from the debris, the rocks, and the base. And in fact the muzzle flash, although that's not yet visible. I only want it illuminating the mech. So let's just see if this light is working properly. I'll open its properties, go to its basic, and we'll turn its light intensity up to 200% just to see if it's working. Yep, it's definitely doing, illuminating from below, doing what we want it to do. 200% is too much though. Let's try 100 and see if that's helping us out. That's a little bit too much. Let's try 75%. Okay, I'm going to go with that for now. The area light is roughly the size of this rock. You know, we could stretch it out to the side. Maybe actually I will do that a little bit, because there is going to be light bouncing off over here as well. So I'm just going to stretch it out a little bit, get a little broader feel. And the nice thing about this is this light is really well justified by this nice big flat rock being in direct light from our key light, and this area light being below gives us the opportunity to show off a little bit more of our lighting and texturing work, even though this is intended to be a nighttime scene. Now, one of the things we're going to talk about, we were intending to talk about, was composition. So let's just go back to our single camera view to see what our composition is going to look like. There it is. And in any composition, the background, the negative space, is really very important. In this case, because I wanted this to feel like a nighttime battle scene with some bright light source off to one side, I feel that a black negative space may not be perfect for the final imagery, but it's definitely not a bad place to start. What I have decided though is that I think I'd like to slightly reposition my key light so it's not coming quite so far around the front. So I'm going to pop into my light view again for a moment, and I'm going to select my key light, and I'm going to try to push that light a little bit back. I should actually make this into a split view again, with the Viper on one side and the camera view, so I can actually see what's going on as I do it. So as I push this light back, there's going to be less light coming from the side. That actually feels a little bit better. And you know what would make this feel even a little more intense and a little bit less like sunlight is if I made that light color a little bit less like sunlight. So less like sunlight means cooler. Let's see if we can cool this light color down. So I'll go to my Kelvin color temperature, and I'm going to pick maybe 10,000 Kelvin, somewhere around there, and see what that does for us. Okay, that's cooling it off a little bit. Might not be quite saturated enough. Okay, so we have a really bright, intense light now. I'll just let this resolve for a second. So I have this really nice, intense light coming in from one side. It's a little bit too cool to be sunlight. And we have this nice warm firelight rim coming in from the other side. Got a nice bounce from below. We have a fill light coming in from the right side. I think this image is ready for render, a turntable render. So I'm going to leave the VFPR and go into texture shaded solid just so I can move around more quickly. Now that I've done a whole bunch of work here, I'm going to save my scene, and I'm going to remember to save my objects as well. I like to save all objects. And now I'll go into my top view, and I want to rotate my model in front of my camera. Now, not everybody likes to do that. Some people prefer to rotate their camera around the object. And that's fine, except that you're going to show off the form of your model a lot better if you rotate it through unmoving lights. So I'll render up both of those. I'll render one render with the model rotating through the light, and I'll render it again with the camera moving around the object and the lights not changing, and you can make up your own mind. Okay, here we are back again. I've rendered out two turntables, one with the object turning under the light and the other one with the camera rotating around the object. And I've rendered them half-res just to render them out quickly, and it's always a good idea to render when you have your first pass of your textures done. Render them out half-res, get a quick look at it so you can get back to work on them once you find out all the things that are wrong with them. So I'll start this one. This is our object rotating under the light. I've called it OBJ rotate, and this one here is the camera rotating. And I'm just going to I'll loop this so you can continue to watch that to rotate. And the camera rotate, I'll also loop it so we can watch it rotate. So what you notice on the left-hand side one is that the light plays across the object as it rotates, which really shows off a lot of the form. It's nice to see the variation of the light moving across the object and the shadow moving. It gives it a lot more interest and shows off the work a lot more. Here on the right hand side we have the camera rotating around the object, and it is also an interesting way to present it. It definitely shows off more of the lighting that's around the different sides, but doesn't show off the texturing or the forms quite as well. You can still see the reflections moving across the object, so there's still some interest here. Personally, I prefer to rotate under light. However, you may prefer this method. It's entirely up to you. It's a totally subjective call. This render has revealed some serious problems with the texture work that we've done, and this is pretty typical. It's very difficult when you're working with highly specular or highly reflective materials to know that they're really good until you have gone to the trouble of rendering them out in motion to see how light plays across them as they move. So after I saw the issues with this half-res one, I went ahead and rendered out a full-res version. So let's take a quick look at that. Okay, so here's our full-res render, and here's our single frame. It looks pretty cool, but watch what happens when we set it in motion. The first thing you'll notice probably is that the reflections all over the body are really bizarre. It looks almost like it's really shiny, polished, almost glassy. And you could make a material for a mech like this that was like that, and that would be fine. But it just doesn't feel realistic. In order for this guy for his camouflaging to work, for him to be less visible in the field, his armor really needs to be not reflective like this. And I think the reason for this is we drove the reflection channel in most of the armor without plugging in the reflection map, so we're going to actually go back and revisit that. Some of the things that are working, if you look at these side pieces here, they're feeling really nice and matte, and they've got that nice camo look on them. So we're going to go back and add a little bit more camo look to the whole rest of the armor. And we're also going to revisit this brass. It's feeling a little bit too reflective, and the gun is obviously way too shiny. I will probably take reflectivity off that entirely and make it matte as well. So this will conclude the Lightwave 10 texturing volume 1. In this video we've covered some production-friendly naming assignments and setting up decent geometry. We've looked at doing basic material construction using the layer-based system, and we've gotten to a little bit more complex work using the node system. We've done some turntable lighting techniques, and we've looked a little bit at composition. And in volume 2, we're going to take the same model, we're going to pick up where we left off. We're going to texture the rocks and the debris in the base that's left, and we're going to get into refining all the textures in our mech, including fixing the errors that we identified by creating the turntable of this object, starting with the reflection on most of the armor, and then working our way through the gun belt, which is too reflective. The gun itself is too reflective. We're going to take that camo motif that we started on the gun and parts of the armor, we're going to apply it across the rest of the model. And we're going to do some real refinements there. And then we're going to add the muzzle flash to the end. We're going to look at a couple of ways of doing that. We're going to apply muzzle flash imagery to some polygons to see how that looks. And then we're also going to try a volumetric solution to that. And this isn't just a matter of putting some more polygons or putting a volumetric at the end of the light. This is also a lighting opportunity because a muzzle flash is very intense and very specific light source right in front of the subject. So that gives us a really interesting lighting opportunity. We can add some real punch to this image, some real dramatic feel to it. So I hope you'll join me in volume 2 of LightWave 10 texturing.